Bienvenidas todas a este evento que organiza el núcleo del exterior en Gran Bretaña, del PCE, que hemos titulado Derechos Laborales e Inmigración en el Reino Unido. El evento, como sabéis, tiene por objetivo un poco introducir lo que ha sido la historia del movimiento obrero organizado en el país, introducir también de cara a la clase trabajadora migrante que quiera asentarse o incluso quiera un poco conocer cuál es la situación de la clase trabajadora en este país, pues un poco revisar o hablar, discutir un poco de los derechos laborales con los que la clase trabajadora ahora mismo cuenta. Y finalmente, una ex camarada de nuestro partido, del PCE, y ahora camarada del Communist Party of Britain, nos hablará un poco de por qué es necesario que la migración, que la clase trabajadora que ha migrado a otro país, continúe organizada con las organizaciones de clase que existen y que luchan por sus derechos en el país de destino. Contamos en este evento con tres ponentes de gran experiencia organizativa. Tenemos a Phil Katz, Dominic Macaskill y Judith Cazorla, que pasaré luego a introducir personalmente. No me he introducido yo soy Marc Bilbao, responsable del área externa de este núcleo del PCE Exterior en Gran Bretaña, y voy a hacer un poco de presentador en este evento. Recordaros a todos y a todas que cada uno de los ponentes hará su exposición. Al final de las tres exposiciones lo que daremos serán unos 20-30 minutos en los que estáis todas invitadas a escribir preguntas, dudas que podéis dejar reflejadas en el chat de YouTube, y nosotros pues pasaremos a intentar responderlas o a tener una discusión alrededor de ellas. Así pues, una cosa más, como veis, los ponentes, y como veréis, los ponentes son miembros del CPB, son gente de aquí, de este país, por tanto, van a dirigirse a nosotros en inglés, y yo, por lo tanto, voy a introducir a cada uno de ellos primero en español y luego en inglés, y ellos nos van a hablar en inglés. Al final de todo, nuestra intención es poder colgar este vídeo a YouTube con una pista de subtítulos, tanto en español como en inglés, para que todo el mundo pueda seguir el evento. Así pues, vuelvo a introducir el evento en inglés para nuestros camaradas del país, del Reino Unido. Welcome everyone to this event today that we've organized the Spanish Communist Party in his section here in the UK. We're here today in this event to talk about labor rights and the situation and immigration in the UK, in order to offer an introduction to the history of the organized labor movement here in the UK and how it has managed in this country through class struggle to acquire a certain set of rights, of labor rights, that then afterwards we'll try to discuss and visit and see with which labor rights can the migrant population, in particular the migrant working class, can count when trying to establish himself or herself here in this country. We count today with three great speakers that I will afterwards introduce personally. We count with Phil Katz, Dominic Macaskill, and Judith Cazorla, which will be responsible for, again, introducing and discussing with us all these topics. They will all have their time to speak, and in the end, feel invited to reflect your questions, your doubts in the YouTube chat, because we will then leave in the ending of this event around 20-30 minutes to answer and to try to discuss whatever doubts or questions you all have. Without then much further ado, I will start. Then the event can finally start. I will first introduce Phil Katz, and I will go back to Spanish in order to do it, and then back to English. Phil Katz es diseñador gráfico y aparte, es autor de varios libros de historia. Uno de ellos, de hecho, lo tengo aquí, Freedom from Tyranny, que trata un poco de la resistencia popular y en particular de las International Brigades en la Guerra Civil Española y después durante la Segunda Guerra Mundial contra el nazifascismo en todo el continente. Es también responsable de comunicación en el Communist Party of Britain y está hoy aquí para presentarnos un poco cuál ha sido la historia del movimiento obrero organizado en este país y cuáles han sido los derechos que al final han conseguido a través de una lucha muchas veces pues sangrienta y valiente. Phil, I will now again introduce you in English. How are you? Thank you very much for being here. Yeah. Phil Katz is a graphic designer and also author of different books in history that I will show again. This book that I have here, Freedom from Tyranny, which talks a bit of the popular resistance of the peoples from Europe, in particular, the peoples that joined the international brigades against the Franco sublevation in the Spanish Civil War and then in the Second World War against Nazi fascism in the whole continent. Phil is also head of communications of the Communist Party of Britain and is here today to talk us about which is the history of the organized labor movement in this country and which are the rights that through this struggle, through class struggle, and most times bloody but also valiant struggle, which rights have they managed to achieve? Without much further ado, Phil, the floor is yours, and thank you very much for being here with us.
Thanks, Mark. Good evening to you all. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to say that if ever I ask Mark for a favor, he always says yes straight away. So when he rang me, I said yes without even asking what it was. I felt obliged to agree. And then he said, we need you to illustrate the history of the development of capitalism recently and the workers' movement, and you've got 20 minutes. So it's a little bit like one of those complete works of Shakespeare in 30 seconds. But I haven't got the sense of humor for that. So I thought I would introduce a cutoff point, if that's acceptable to you, which coincides with the centenary of the Communist Party this year in Britain. Last year, and of the Young Communists this year, and I believe of PCE in November as well. Congratulations. I hope it's acceptable for me not to start with the Peasants' Revolt of 1300s and to start instead with the last 100 years. Of course, the 100 years leaves out some very rich and very interesting moments in British history, and I would urge you all to familiarise yourself with such elements as the Chartists or the struggle of women for the right to vote. These are full of lessons and of inspiration. So what kind of journey have we had over this last 100 years? I think it would help you if I broke this into periods. I'm aware that because of the Franco dictatorship, your experience is very different from ours. And in fact, I hope that the big differences that you find in what I say and your experience in Spain is a creative thing, because we do not fear contrast and nor do we fear contradiction. And this may allow for a broader reflection on both sides. Basically, we're going to break into three periods. The first is between the two wars, the Great Wars. The second is between 1945 and 1979. And then after that, a form of the emergence of neoliberalism with the bank crash of 2008 and the COVID pandemic. In all of these episodes, it's possible to detect powerful undercurrents, mainly associated with changes to the way that capital is owned, the biggest being the shift from industrial to finance, but also how workers organize to resist those changes. And the clash between these forces is the thing that drives our story this evening. The period between the wars was one of crisis, of tremendous economic hardship and unemployment, of internal migration and migration abroad, of families and communities broken up, and the extension of monopoly ownership of capital, which was supported by the government. It was an unusual time for Britain in that we had a national government which brought together an alliance of the bourgeois parties. I know that that's more common on the continent. It's very unusual here. That government pursued appeasement, which was a sometimes passive, sometimes aggressive war against the Soviet Union. And they appeased the likes of Franco, the likes of Mussolini, and the likes of Hitler in the hope that they would turn against the Soviet Union rather than against the West. In Britain, the class struggle would go backwards and forwards. We lost the great miners' strike of 1926, but were able to partially defeat the unemployed means test. The black shirt fascists were defeated at home, but fascism spiraled out of control abroad. We have great pride in the volunteers that we sent to fight in Spain, which was a high point in class consciousness. But really it was only necessary because the government refused to stand up to fascism. And after the sellout at Munich, the struggle for peace became desperate. Into the second phase, which begins with the war. Similar to the way the world has had to react to COVID, government intervention took place on a massive scale. And the government itself was reshaped so that the state took the lead in political and economic life. The communists, of course, were largely excluded, but major industry was taken into government control. Workers' rights for the first time became law, and women entered new areas of the economy and the union movement. This was what we called a people's war, and the war front was matched by a home front. During this period, the idea of socialism became very popular and viable, but it was largely associated with state control. The government restructured capital in the war industries, closing down a lot of uneconomic enterprises. But new towns were created. Labour became a force for change, and an education service and a health service, which were the pride of the people, were created and still endure today, but they're constantly under attack. When Britain emerged from the war, all of the major industries were nationalised, but the empire, which had allowed British capital to operate within a protected zone on a world scale, was finished. Britain was in debt to the new rising imperialism of the USA and paid for this debt by supporting the dirty and reactionary wars in Greece, Malaya, Korea, up to the occupation of the Suez Canal. And as a junior partner in imperialism, it gradually withdrew from India and Palestine. So from that period of post-1945 right up to 1979, there were significant changes to the way that capitalism was structured in this country. Employers began to orientate themselves towards the common market rather than the empire. They played a supporting role in NATO and energetically pursued a Cold War, including repression of communists at home. Social democracy became noticeably less radical, and a standoff between the capitalist class and the working class emerged. Capital didn't re-energize itself, it did not invest, Productivity declined along with the rate of profitability in the major industries. Some writers say that a consensus emerged between the two classes as if it was a tidy agreement not to rock the boat too much. But I prefer standoff rather than consensus, and this was a period of constant struggle and major strikes going on for a long time and having a powerful effect, particularly in, say, the docks. The trade union movement at its height in the mid-70s reached a figure of 13 million organised workers, with powerful and often communist-led rank-and-file movements, and these proved strong enough to break governments. But they didn't have the politics or the power to challenge the system, and at the same time the capitalists didn't have the power to break the working class. Which brings us to our third period, which is still ongoing. And this is the turning point, was the election of Margaret Thatcher in 1979. Amongst the things that she did was to remove all controls on the movement of capital, so that British investment abroad grew enormously, as did foreign investment in Britain. The main utilities like gas and water were privatised, along with strategic ones such as communications and energy, and pharmaceuticals. Some of our younger viewers might be surprised to know that the much spoken of AstraZeneca used to be a state and publicly owned company in this country called ICI. Thatcher pretended to have a share-owning democracy where she wanted to democratise the ownership of business. But as with everything she said, the exact opposite happened. And most capital and shares were taken by the big finance houses. The Cold War was stepped up, unemployment grew, subsidies were removed from industry so that the core industries where workers were powerful were effectively destroyed. Britain became fully integrated into the common market, and the direction of policy within the capitalist class moved from industry to finance and the city, and from Britain to transnational giants which relied on the support of government to operate. Now, you can probably tell by the colour of my hair that I remember these times, and they were very dark and difficult times. Again, the coal miners led the fight against the Thatcher government, but were heavily defeated after a heroic and year-long strike. Her government was deeply unpopular, but the opposition was very weak. Labour became dominated by right-wing social democracy, and the communists were locked in a near-death struggle over Euro-communism. They were very tough times. And if it couldn't get worse, the loss of the USSR demoralized revolutionaries and appeared to give American imperialism a clear run. Once Thatcher had run her course, a new Blair Social Democratic government was promoted as the bright modern thing. But they were even more energetic in pursuing policies which reinforced the internationalization of capital and its total domination by the city. Millionaires became billionaires, and trade union membership fell to 6 million. Britain under Blair became involved in a succession of aggressive wars to remodel the Middle East, and then later fought again by conservative governments. It's been a constant area of focus for British imperialism. In 2003, we witnessed the biggest march of all time in the country against the war, but we weren't able to stop the war, but it's created a new, younger generation who were generally taken on that march by their parents, as were all of my kids, and are very anti-war now. The state was remodeled, partly because it no longer had to oversee giant industrial concerns. It merely had to administer capitalism so that the city had the maximum amount of freedom. Parliament became weaker in relation to Brussels and Strasbourg. There was the devolution of some powers to new parliaments in Scotland and Wales. But regional government in England was a mess and a patchwork of compromises that stop it from doing much that's effective, for example, building homes. Privatisation of the great public services began in the 1980s, was stepped up to include welfare, education, and health provision. And this process was accelerated by the EU. Labour, in shorthand, represented that section of capital which wanted to confront the USSR within the context of total support for a Europe with a social dimension. And some conservatives did support that approach, but another section of capital, wedded to America, finance, and concerned at the rise of China, Brazil, and Russia, were elected and triggered a vote on EU membership. This referendum in June 2016 divided both classes, workers and capitalists, and it further sharpened the tension between capitalists and the peoples of Britain in England, Scotland, and Wales. The British had never been given a vote on the common market, and they weren't allowed a vote on Maastricht or Lisbon for 40 years. But everybody knew that opposition was strong and represented a wide range of opinion, from the right-wing conservatives to the communists who had opposed power block politics and economics as a dead end since 1955. So both camps had progressive and reactionary strains. During this period, capitalism proved adept at reinventing itself as the only alternative, and the loss of the USSR helped with this. But the rise of China has meant that it was short-lived. Britain was changing beyond recognition. Forests were sold off, communities were abandoned, the youth were demonized, jobs became radically restructured as protective laws were loosened. Jobs became on demand, just in time, gig, contracts and employment law were shredded. So now we are experiencing the anarchic spread of a fourth industrial revolution, which, because of the weakness of public sector in Britain, the lack of state resources and the waste that comes through the competition between capitalists, the fourth industrial revolution has only been partially implemented and in very limited ways. For example, when COVID struck and schooling had to be moved into the home, it was found that millions of people had insufficient funds, computers, or Wi-Fi connectivity to be able to partake of those advantages. So what that's proved is that they talk a good game of advanced technology, but it's still gone to removing jobs. Automation has resulted in the shredding of jobs and the enrichment of the super rich, and the benefits haven't come to the working class. At the moment, the communists are conducting their biggest election campaign since the early 1980s. But behind it is a combination of organizing a fight back against unemployment and promoting in the workers' movement a discussion about the future of work. What kind of future do we want? How do we define skill? What is the relation of workers to artificial intelligence and the machine question? And what about the 8-hour day? So the workers' movement has changed too. And just to finish, really, overwhelmingly now, membership is in the public services. Its majority is now female, and a majority either have a degree or a higher level qualification in a skill. There are far fewer unions than there used to be. In 1900, which is 120 years ago, my union, the Graphical Union, was one of 91 print unions in Britain. Now it simply exists as a section of a big general union. So there are fewer unions, they are bigger, they're more diversified, but they are also struggling to engage with members. And the central staff of the TUC has become a weaker sideshow. In all of that, the voice of socialism has begun to recover, and many young people are engaged in political life, especially on issues such as rights at work and climate change. And in Scotland and Wales, they are voting at 16. Challenges such as the Brexit vote, the Corbyn movement in 2016 to 2019, and also to an extent the growth of the Communist Party, means that there are alternatives being discussed everywhere. The working class movement has managed to stop the retreat of the recent decades, but is now again to face a major onslaught of unemployment. But the difference is that this time the government is weaker, and because of Brexit, it is much more vulnerable to pressure. So there's everything to fight for, and we will use every tool at our disposal to fight that struggle through to a successful conclusion. Well, I think that was almost exactly 20 minutes, Mark, but you can see now why I started in 1920 rather than 1300.
Yeah, that's been fantastic. Yeah, it was truly a bit of a challenge to try to summarize all that in 20 minutes, but you've definitely
I'll get
managed
my
it
revenge
in...
one day. Thank you.
Sorry?
I'll get my revenge one day.
Okay. Thank you, Phil, for that. It's been a splendid introduction to this event. So now moving on to our next guest speaker, Dominic Macaskill. Dominic es una persona con una gran trayectoria de organización sindical, es organizador sindical en el sindicato Unison, en su sección de Gales, y también es miembro del Partido Comunista Británico, en su sección también galesa. Él, una vez ya introducida cuál ha sido más o menos la historia de la lucha de clases, del desarrollo de la lucha de clases en este país, Dominic nos va a hablar de cuál es la situación actual, con qué derechos laborales podemos realmente contar si queremos asentarnos en este país y cuál es un poco la situación del derecho, por ejemplo, de sindicación y cómo se organizan los diferentes sindicatos ahora mismo en este país. Dominic Macaskill, well, thank you very much for coming here. I will introduce you now in English. Dominic is a person with a great experience in organizing. In the midst of the labor movement, he's a trade union organizer, working with Unison in his Welsh section, and also is a member of the Communist Party of Britain, also in his in the Welsh section of the party. Now, after this introduction on how the class struggle has developed in the recent years here in this country, Dominic will introduce to us which are actually right now the rights with which the migrants, with which the working class that might try to settle in this country can count with, and which is more or less the situation as well of rights such as the right of syndication, and how are the different trade unions are organized, and how do they, organize labor among them. with all this and without much further ado, thank you very much, Dominic, for being here with us, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Mark, and thank you to the Spanish Communist Party for this invite. It's very important for trade unionists to speak to a migrant population, because certainly the trade union I work for, which is a public sector trade union, organises a lot of migrant workers who fill in a lot of the hard to fill jobs in our public services. Following on from Phil's very informative overview of the last 100 years of trade union history, my presentation is much more current and practical, but is also equally as daunting in terms of its scope. But I will be covering some of the realities of working in UK today. But first, what I want to cover is I'm going to give a brief introduction about how I came to the trade union movement, but then go on to very much the specifics of the actual rights you have as a worker in Britain today, but also how a trade union fits in with those rights and the rights to be a trade union member, and then a brief overview of some of the trade union options and the work of the trade union movement in the UK. But I'm going to be touching particularly on Wales, because that's where I've done nearly all of my trade union work. As Mark says, I work for a large public sector trade union in Wales. And although I've been described as a trade union organiser, currently my main role is strategic. I'm head of bargaining for my union in Wales, and I manage a team of trade union organisers. So less hands-on than I used to be. I work in Wales. I'm a naturalised Welshman. I am a migrant within the UK. I'm from a Yorkshire coalfield community where I was born and raised. I moved to Wales in my early 20s to train to be a social worker in Cardiff University. And it was whilst I was a student that I joined the Communist Party. And my first political activities were around student politics and the anti-poll tax struggle. And both of those could be a separate meeting. This was a time of Thatcherism, and Phil's referenced the big changes that Thatcher brought into the UK. And all of its associated attacks on working people's lives. But the time that I got involved, it was also a time of growing resistance to these anti-working class policies. And when I started my first job way back as a social worker way back in 1989, I started the job 3 days before a 3-day national strike of local government workers over pay. So on my first day, I joined the trade union for local government workers, which was called NALGO in those days. It then merged into Unison, which is the current trade union. And I was on strike in my third day of employment, which gratefully for myself, was a successful introduction to the trade union movement, because we won a much needed 12% pay rise. And it was from that, it was the keenness that I showed of joining the union on day one and getting involved in the strike that my colleagues in my new workplace within a few months had actually nominated me to be a shop steward. And that really started a lifetime of trade union activity at all levels of a branch of Wales as a lay activist. And then, best part of 20 years ago, I realised that the trade union work had taken over from my social work as my primary occupation. And so I then was employed. I went for and was employed as a trade union organizer full time, and that's where. And I currently work for the same trade union as I did as I was an activist for, but way back in '89. So anyway, that's enough about me, but I just wanted to give you a bit of a context of how I came to the trade union movement, because my experience could be your experience, and this is what is the message I'll start with and I'll finish with, is that every member of the trade union has the ability, but also I'd say the right and the duty to take an active part in their trade union, not necessarily to the extent that I did, where it takes over your life, but to actually take some responsibility for what are the largest democratic voluntary organisations, but in this country. But they're obviously very key to our communities and key to our workplaces. So now I want to go on to give you a basic overview of what you can expect in terms of rights in employment in the UK. And these are the rights which have been hard won, as Phil has briefly described in his presentation. But we constantly need defending, because unfortunately they're always under attack, at the same time as us trying to expand and improve those rights as well. The most important thing you need to do when you are starting a job is to look at your employment status and determine for yourself whether you are an employee, whether you're a worker, or whether you are self-employed. If you're an employee, you have rights at work. If you are a worker, you also have some rights, but less rights than if you were an employee. And if you're categorized as self-employed, you have no employment rights at all. And a lot of employers will try to falsely claim that somebody is self-employed when they're actually employees or workers, in order to avoid the rights which are associated with being an employee or a worker. And you can, if you recall the recent legal cases around Uber drivers and Deliveroo, where these declared self-employed workers have actually been determined to be actually employees or workers. So an employee is somebody who works under terms of an employment contract. And a worker is a much more wider definition, basically a person who works for a company. And it's important before you start your employment, is to ask for your contract of employment or a statement of your terms and conditions, which should usually be contained in your letter of appointment. So what rights do you have as a worker? Well, as a worker, you have the rights to be paid the national minimum wage, and I'll come on to that in a bit more detail later. But you also have protection against unlawful deduction of wages. So what you should be paid, you should get paid. A statutory minimum level of paid holiday, and a statutory minimum length of time for rest breaks. The maximum working week of 48 hours applies unless you have opted out of that. And you've got protection against unlawful discrimination. As an employee, you have all of those rights, plus you have the right to statutory sick pay, statutory maternity, paternity, adoption, and shared parental leave and pay. The requirements for minimum notice periods if your contract is being ended or you are being dismissed, and you have protection against unfair dismissal, and you have the right to statutory redundancy pay. Having said that, those last two, there is a qualification period, so you don't get those rights on day one. You acquire those over the first after the first 2 years of your employment. So you can see that although being an employee gives you some rights, they're pretty basic, and these were rights which are hard fought for and are being constantly attempted to be undermined. There are many different contracts. So as well as the full-time and part-time contracts, you've got your fixed-term contracts, you've got people who are employed by agencies, you've got freelancers, consultants, contractors, you've got people employed on 0 hours contracts. So you can see that the employment makeup is very confusing, deliberately so, and that is why it is so important that from day one you join your trade union, because that's where you will get your specialist advice. So joining a trade union. So what are your rights to be a member of a trade union? Well, you have a right to choose to join or not to join a trade union. You can decide to leave or remain a member of a trade union. You have the right to belong to a trade union you choose. So if your employer negotiates with one trade union, you have the right to be a member of the other trade union, even though that employer doesn't necessarily recognise that trade union for negotiations or collective bargaining. And you're allowed to belong to more than one trade union. And your employer is not allowed to offer you a benefit to leave your trade union. They're not allowed to threaten to treat you unfairly if you do not leave a trade union or if you're a member of a trade union. An employer or an employment agency is not allowed to insist that you join or leave a trade union or leave one union for another union. And so if there's a particular sweet relationship with one union, they can't insist that you're a member of that one and not a more challenging trade union. Your employer is not allowed to dismiss you or choose you for redundancy because you are or want to be a union member. And they are not allowed to dismiss or choose you for redundancy if you are not or do not want to be a union member. So there may be, it works the other way as well. Or they cannot dismiss you or select you for redundancy because you took part or wanted to take part in union activities. So additionally, your employer must not treat you unfavorably. So, for example, refusing you promotion or training opportunities if you are a trade union, if you're a member of a trade union, or take part in a trade union meeting, or for any other reason associated with your trade union member. So although you may feel that being in a trade union may antagonize an employer, being a member of a trade union is a right which is defined clearly in law. So going on in terms of, I mentioned the minimum wage, which is a right if you're a worker or an employee. And the minimum wage was a policy which was introduced by a Labour government, but following a number of decades of campaigning by trade unions, in particular NUPE, which is one of the founding members of Unison, and so the trade union movement was at the heart of the campaign for a national living wage. Having said that, it is limited at the moment to £8.72, and that's if you are over 22 years of age. And if you're, the amount is less the younger you are, and as low as £4.15 if you're an apprentice. That is not to be confused with what we describe as the real living wage, which is an independently calculated rate, which is the minimum which can be sufficient for somebody to live with a certain amount of dignity and out of in-work poverty. And the rate of the real living wage is £9.50 for all age groups. And if you live in London, it's £10.85. I also touched on working hours. You can't be required to work longer than 48 hours a week on average, and this is normally averaged over a 17-week period. And you mustn't work for over 13 hours in any one day. Having said that, you are able to opt out of that, and sometimes unscrupulous employers will put soft pressure on some of you to do that, but you're not required to do that. So those are your basic rights in work. Now I'm going to touch briefly on the trade union movement in the UK at the current current state of affairs. Currently, trade union density in the UK is only 23%, so less than a quarter of the workforce are actually organised collectively. Having said that, that does vary around the UK, and in Wales, where I work, it's just over 30%, so nearer to a third rather than a quarter of workers organised in a trade union. But as Phil stated in his presentation, that is mainly in the public sector, where trade union density can be as high as 60 or 70% in some areas. And in terms of which trade union to join, well, there are, as Phil has mentioned, there are a number of trade unions which are large general trade unions. And originally, as Phil again said, there was a whole range of different trade unions you could join, and usually associated with the service or the trade that you worked in. But gradually, over time, through a merger process, these have become larger bodies and more general in nature. Having said that, so the main general unions are Unite and the GMB, albeit the largest trade union in the UK at present is Unison, which is a public sector trade union. So although it does organise private sector workers, those private sector workers are delivering a public service. So it's very much a public service union, only organising workers who deliver public services. But you also have a civil servants union, which is known as the PCS. You have a retail union, USDOR. You have even an actors union, Equity. You have a prison officers union, a fire brigade union. You have the RMT if you work on the rail. If you're a driver of a train, you'd be in ASLEF. There's a whole number of teachers unions, including head teachers unions, and in the health service you have very small and specific societies. So the Society of Radiologists, the Chartered Society of Physiotherapists, and the British Association of Occupational Therapists. The latter one is actually has an arrangement with Unison, so it's if you're a member of the British Association of Occupational Therapists, you actually get the benefit of all of the Unison structures and organisations. So we've got a big choice of trade unions, and what I would suggest is when you're considering which trade union to join, have a look at the workplace you're joining. Is a trade union organising in the workplace that you join? And if it is, I would suggest that you go with the trade union that is organising in your workplace as the best starting point. If there isn't a trade union organising in your workplace, then you look for the best organised one in the area, or the one that's particularly linked to the area of work that you're going to be working in. So you don't need to work for an employer that recognises a trade union to belong to a trade union. That's a very clear point. In fact, most workplaces outside of the public sector may not even recognise the trade union for collective bargaining purposes. But it is, and that's so there isn't any automatic right for collective bargaining. Having said that, you can, as a trade union, win the right to collective bargaining. So if you have the majority of staff as members of your union in what they describe as a bargaining unit, so for an employer providing a particular service or a particular manufacturing area, and you have a union has over 50% of those staff in membership of that union, then you can apply to the Central Arbitration Committee to request recognition. And if you can demonstrate clearly you have a majority of that staff in your union, then it should be an automatic that the employer will be told that you need to recognise that trade union for collective bargaining purposes. However, even if you've just got 10% of those staff in membership, you can actually again approach that body, the Central Arbitration Committee, and trigger a ballot of all of the staff for a trade union recognition. And you remember the case of Amazon, which was a ballot which was created for trade union recognition with Amazon. Unfortunately, that was unsuccessful because of the Amazon launched a massive campaign amongst its staff against that recognition. So there's a very complex approach recognition as well, but that's basics, the basics behind it. Also, it's not straightforward to go on strike as well. And in the 70s, before Thatcher started her anti-working class politics and attacks on the trade unions, it was very simple to call for a stoppage in a workplace. You just gather together the membership and in a large open space and call for a show of hands. And if you have a majority in favour of walking out, you just walked out. Now you have to go through a whole rigorous timetable process and evidence your membership, evidence the bargaining unit, evidence all of those things within a set time frame, providing that evidence to the employer. And when you get through all of those hurdles, you have to have a minimum turnout of your membership of 50% in order to make that ballot valid. And in certain public sectors, you need to have at least 40% of your eligible members supporting industrial action in order to take industrial action. So you can imagine if you have just get over that threshold of 50%, you'll need to have 80% of your members voting for strike action in order to take strike action. So you can see how those anti-union policies are looking to fetter trade union power in the workplace by preventing strike action. But I suppose the one positive thing is that it does set a real challenge to the trade union movement to actually better engage with its members. And the communication workers unions organised a ballot of post office workers unions and did it so systematically that they managed to get over all of those thresholds. Having said that, the employer still challenged them in court over some minutiae of what they did or didn't do during that ballot process. So it is still a massive undertaking to get over the hurdle of industrial action in this country. So what about getting more involved in the trade union? Because that's coming back to what I've said earlier, is that it's not just good enough, I think, for people to be a member of the trade union, although it's clearly essential. And even if that's all you're going to do, that helps, because the higher the density of a trade union within a workplace, the more bargaining power it does have. But the real power comes from the involvement of the members in any action or any campaigns that you take. And that's why I'm keen to encourage anybody who's in work to join the trade union, become active, because there's lots of life-enhancing roles that you can do as a trade unionist, and you get full training and accreditation for any role that you take on. So you could be a branch officer of a branch, a secretary, a chair, a treasurer, a membership secretary. So all of the basic bureaucracies of a trade union you could be, and that may play to some of your strengths. You could, if you're a particular interest in health and safety, you could be a health and safety officer. In Wales, we have the Wales Union Learning Fund, which is a Welsh government sponsored workplace learning, and you can trade unions can appoint union learning reps who link in with the workforce to encourage uptake of lifelong learning opportunities for the membership. But we also, a lot of trade unions organise self-organised groups. So for black workers, for LGBT plus workers, for disabled members, for young workers, and which is a way of people to organise in what would be a safe environment and learn trade unionism in that conducive environment. So there's plenty of opportunities to get involved and plenty of different roles to take on in the trade union movement, and including the environmental. In Wales now you have a trade union environment reps, which will be recognised in the workplace as well. So going back to Wales and my experience now, as I've identified in the UK, employment rights are pretty minimal and under constant attack. Having said that, the climate for trade unions varies within the UK, and in Wales, although trade union rights aren't devolved, the Welsh government, which has been under Labour controlled since the creation of the Welsh Assembly and now the Welsh Parliament, the Senedd, have been much more conducive to trade unions, because obviously there is a clear organic link between trade unions in this country and the Labour Party. I'm not sure whether Phil actually touched on this in his presentation, but it was the trade unions that actually created the Labour Party in the early part of the 20th century. And what that has led to is a partnership working approach of the Welsh government, which led to the establishment of a workforce partnership council, which is a tripartite body which brings together Welsh government, public sector employers, and trade unions organised through the Wales Trade Union Congress. And that body meets to thrash out cross public sector agreements around management of change, around procurement, and around other things which impact on workers' lives. And just prior to the election, which we got an election for the Senedd this year, there was the publishing of the Social Partnership and Public Procurement Wales Bill, which is looking to put that social partnership on a statutory footing. And that legislation will promote tripartite working between trade unions, government and employers at local, regional and national level. So not just doing it at a strategic Welsh Government level, but insisting that it happens at a regional and a local level with employers. And it will establish a social partnership council to provide leadership for this system. And it will also reform public procurement processes to ensure that public procurement is undertaken with consideration to social, economic and environmental and cultural well-being. And so such things, so anybody receiving any public money would be required to pay the real living wage, which is what I've described earlier, if you're bidding for a public contract. And there's measures to tackle modern day slavery, and there is a clear encouragement for employers to recognise trade unions and to encourage trade union membership. So there is definitely a social partnership approach in Wales, which runs counter to the antagonistic approach of the UK government to trade unions. Having said that, partnership, there's a lot of distrust within the trade union movement about partnership working, and feeling that it is an attempt to neuter trade unions by a much more soft approach. And there isn't anything to replace organising collectively, building strong membership engaged trade unions to ensure that you have a powerful voice in the workplace, because there's very little that is being given to working people over the history of capitalism, and all the rights that we enjoy today, albeit they are limited, have been hard fought for and hard won. And so the social partnership approach may well help to retain some of those rights, but it's only through collective action and a mass mobilisation of our membership that we will be able to improve on those rights and ensure that they are built on and not diminished as this current government would have us. So my final message to you is the message I started with, is that there are lots of opportunities in employment in this country, but there are lots of pit holes within that, because there are lots of employers who are trying to pay the minimum and to keep the conditions as worse as possible, because that's where they make their money. And so the clear message is, from day one, make sure you join a trade union. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dominic. That was a fantastic review and summary. Again, like with Phil, that was very challenging to try to summarize all these with 20, 30 minutes. But thank you very much, Dominic. You can see that it has triggered already quite a few questions in the chat that we will try to answer. We can, among all of us, try to discuss them later. So yeah, thank you, Dominic, for your talk. So now moving on to Judith. Judith Cazorla bueno, Judith, la presento, era una ex camarada de las juventudes de la UJTCE, de las juventudes de nuestro partido, el PCE, una vez cuando estaba en España. Al moverse, a instalarse aquí en el país, en Reino Unido, se unió y se empezó a organizar con el Partido Comunista Británico, y hoy viene un poco en calidad de candidata para las elecciones locales que van a celebrarse este mayo, si no me equivoco, y viene a hablarnos pues un poco la continuación un poco lógica de todo lo que ha sido este evento hasta ahora. Si hemos introducido la historia de cómo hemos llegado hasta aquí, cómo se ha desenvolupado la lucha de clases, si hemos introducido cuáles son los derechos a los que ahora mismo cuenta la clase trabajadora, cuál es la situación de la organización del trabajo de la clase obrera, deberíamos seguir nosotros deberíamos seguir organizándonos, como ha dicho Dominic, en las diferentes uniones. Deberíamos seguir organizándonos en los diferentes partidos, en el movimiento feminista, en el movimiento pro de cualquier tipo de derecho social, ante cualquier tipo de derecho discriminatorio. Así que con esto te introduzco. Judith, muchas gracias por estar aquí. Paso ahora al inglés. Judith, thank you for being with us today. Judith was a former comrade from the Spanish Communist Youth, and now, once he came here, installed herself in the UK, she started organizing herself with the Communist Party of Britain, and today comes a bit as a representative, as a candidate for the local elections that will happen this next May, 6th of May, if I'm right. Judith is going to talk about a bit the logical conclusion of this event of today. If Phil has introduced the history of the labor movement, the development of the class struggle in this country, if Dominic has introduced what are the rights that we count with today in this country, which is the situation of trade unionism today in the UK, the question for Judith to answer is that it? Should we continue to organize ourselves, as Dominic said, in trade unions? Should we continue to organize ourselves in the environmental movement, in the feminist movement, in the movement against any sort of social discrimination? So thank you very much, Judith, for being here. And without much further ado, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I will start talking in English, just giving the thanks to Dominic and Phil, because it was an amazing talk. So thank you so much. Y también me gustaría agradecer al núcleo de Gran Bretaña del Partido Comunista de España por haberme invitado hoy. La verdad es que para mí es un honor y es algo un poco emotivo, así que muchísimas gracias. Bueno, yo soy Judith Cazorla, me mudé a Londres en el 2019, básicamente porque tenía una situación muy precaria en España en la cual huí cuando me ofrecieron un trabajo en el que me pagaban 3 euros la hora como camarera. Y bueno, Londres es una de las ciudades más caras para vivir, no solamente de Inglaterra, sino de todo el mundo, teniendo en el ranking mundial de los... O sea, perdonad, estoy un poco nerviosa. Teniendo en el ranking mundial de los mercados inmobiliarios la posición 11ª, con unos 500 pounds, que serían como 600 euros de media por alquiler. Y esto está sacado del 2020, que es después de toda la crisis del COVID, que obviamente han bajado muchísimo. Antes estaban sobre los 800 pounds, algo así, como promedio. También en cuanto al transporte, es una de las ciudades más caras. El viaje en metro puede costarte alrededor de las 10 libras, dependiendo de dónde trabajes y vivas. Además de que si conduces y tienes que pasar por el centro de Londres, tienes que pagar también una tasa que en teoría es para reducir el tráfico y la contaminación, pero al final es otra medida económica que afecta sobre todo a los trabajadores que tienen que pasar por el centro, como por ejemplo puede ser un conductor de takeaway, de comida para llevar, o cualquier trabajador que tenga que trabajar pues por esa zona, que es zona 1. Es verdad, como ha comentado el camarada Dominic, que en comparación con España los sueldos son bastante más elevados, pero también, sobre todo en Londres, no los sueldos, sino el nivel de vida en cuanto económicamente, y si económicamente es muchísimo mayor. Los trabajos precarios aquí siguen existiendo, sobre todo para la inmigración. La mayoría de inmigrantes son estudiantes o inmigrantes que vienen a trabajar y normalmente acaban en trabajos muy precarios, como puede ser la hostelería o incluso el care work, que sería como el trabajo de cuidador, en el que también siguen existiendo irregularidades. Y sobre todo lo que ha dicho el camarada Dominic de los contratos de 0 horas, que al final son contratos en los que literalmente no te tienen por qué dar horas para trabajar, y con el salario mínimo tendrías que trabajar muchas horas para incluso tener una vida decente y poder llegar a final de mes aquí, sobre todo en Londres. Como inmigrante de España y que llevaba años militando allí, para mí fue un choque político el cómo se organizaban sobre todo los frentes de masas, ya que había trabajado mucho en ellos, y más exactamente lo que se podría calificar como vecinales. Por ejemplo, el movimiento feminista tiene predominantemente un ala liberal, donde todos los colectivos feministas que más se organizan en las calles apuestan, por ejemplo, por la legalización del mal llamado trabajo sexual, o propuestas completamente transfeministas que ni siquiera tienen a la mujer como objeto político y social. También, por ejemplo, con el movimiento antifascista hay una fuerte carencia de fuerza unitaria, por decirlo de alguna manera, y tiende a caer en posiciones muy izquierdistas. También, por ejemplo, con el tema de las asambleas vecinales, lo que se conocería en España como asociaciones de vecinos, están muy institucionalizadas. De hecho, son parte de lo que se llama el council, que sería el ayuntamiento, más o menos. No tienen realmente un poder de autogestión. Y aquí viene, yo creo que nuestro papel como comunistas y también como inmigrantes, porque nosotros somos aún más susceptibles de sufrir todas estas consecuencias, que al final son consecuencias del capitalismo. Por lo tanto, ¿cuál es la solución? Pues el organizarse. Aunque muchas veces no lo veamos como un paso temporal, o yo personalmente lo veo como permanente, creo que es importante formar parte del movimiento obrero ya que la migración es un efecto directo del capitalismo. Por lo tanto, tenemos que entender nuestra importancia como inmigrantes y como trabajadores en el movimiento obrero del país en el que residimos. Además, somos internacionalistas, por lo tanto, tenemos que tender a esa unión entre países. El organizarse en sindicatos, en las asambleas de barrio, toda organización feminista, antifascista, etcétera. Creo que somos los comunistas los que tenemos que liderar un verdadero cambio estructural, tanto dentro de estas organizaciones como en el partido. Y no me refiero a cambiar el partido, sino avanzar en nuestro propósito, donde realmente seamos nosotros, la clase trabajadora, quien pueda empoderarse y dar el paso hacia una democracia mucho más real y crear un movimiento y un tejido social fuerte, que realmente suponga se me olvida la palabra en castellano, pero que sea un verdadero choque contra el capitalismo, tanto dentro como fuera de las instituciones. Y es nuestro papel, el fundamental, como comunistas, el poder dar más pasos hacia un cambio real y no mero el estancarnos como en ciertas posiciones, por decirlo de alguna manera. Y bueno, ha sido un poco corto, un poco más corto que el de los camaradas, pero es.
Muchas gracias, Judith. Has hecho exactamente lo que esperábamos, ha sido exactamente lo que queremos hacer, organizarnos, continuar la lucha. La lucha es nuestra, no la hará otra gente por nosotros. Y aquí estamos, y un ejemplo pues es tu historia y tu lucha y tu organización, tanto con el Partido Comunista cuando estabas en España y ahora con los camaradas del Partido Comunista Británico, como has dicho, con todo el internacionalismo del mundo. Muchas gracias a todos. Thank you very much, all of you, for your speeches. All of them were fantastic. They were wonderful, truly. As I mentioned before, we have quite a few questions in the chat, and now we will open this round of trying to answer them. Now, most of them are directed to Dominic. They refer directly to labor rights. So I will try to read them. I will try to group some of them so that we can, well, be a bit more concise in our answers. But I will start with the first one. Alice asks, are there any specific programs to encourage migrants to be part of unions? And a very similar question Hector made was, makes sense for a migrant worker to join a union even if they know that they're only working on the UK for a certain amount of time before leaving the country? This is the question.
Okay, I can certainly speak for Unison, which is the union that I work for, and that we have organised migrant workers in the public services for some considerable time. So there's a particular program with the health service around Filipino health workers, and we organise particularly amongst the Filipino community, but particularly around EU migrant workers. We when Brexit was developing and it became clear that we would be moving out of the EU, we became involved with the Settled campaign, which was a campaign to ensure that the EU, that people who were born in the EU or working in the UK knew about their rights to claim settled status. And so we've been working with the Settled campaign to reach out to EU workers. We've bargained with Welsh Government and with public sector employers to ensure that they provide information clearly to their workforce around the requirements to gain settled status. And the aim of that campaign, from our point of view, was to better organise ourselves amongst EU workers as well, because in particular in the public sector, in certainly in health and social care, there's a large number of EU workers who we haven't historically connected well with, but we've better done so since that are working with the Settled campaign. In terms of whether if you're only intending to stay for a short period of time, and is it worth being in a trade union, I think the very points that I made at the very start around from day one, being very clear about what your employment status is, and having an organisation which is very familiar with how to argue and to present yourself to ensure that your employment rights are maximised, then being in a trade union from day one is useful, albeit a lot of your trade union rights are actually only accumulated after a period of time in employment. It's still useful to have the collective support of a trade union behind you, even if you're only going to be a temporary worker in the UK. Was there anything else? Was another element to the question?
No, that was the two questions. I think you answered them. Thank you, Dominic. Before I continue with the questions, Judith just left us. I actually forgot to say that she had already told us that she has some work to finish, and she would be leaving us after her speech. So even though we haven't had the occasion to say that to her directly, if you are watching this again in your house whenever you finish your work, thank you very much, Judith, for your contribution, and you know that we are here for you, both speaking for the Communist Party of Spain, but I'm sure that that's the case as well for the British Communist Party. Following then with the rest of the questions. Now, there are two that relate a bit to what you were saying now, Dominic, regarding Brexit. Alice asks if there might be any particular problem with that Brexit might cause specifically to EU workers. And Hector added, if workers come after the Brexit is implied, is there going to be any limit to the right of syndication, to the right of joining a union?
Yeah. Okay. Which part to take first? In terms of the rights, what are the issues for EU workers in this country at the moment? Well, the first one is that is ensure that you have, if you're wishing to remain in the UK and to work in the UK, you need to have had applied for settled status. There was an extension, I believe, I think it's still, even if you haven't, there's still time to do so, because I believe the deadline was extended. So that's the key bit if you're wishing to stay and work in the UK. If you have arrived after 31st of December 2020, then you won't have an automatic right to remain. Even if you claim it, you'll need to actually apply for immigration status. That's my understanding of it. Although, as I say, I'm not a hands-on organizer now. I'm more strategic. So the details of the specifics of that, but it's certainly your status changes if you have arrived after the 31st of December 2020. There was another element to the question which it's just gone out of my head. If you could remind me of that was.
Sorry, I was muted. Nothing apart from what you've mentioned. If there's any other problem that you can think of that workers from the union might have when trying to, from the European Union might have to when joining a union. But I think you more or less answered the question, unless you think that there's something that might be added.
No, I think the key thing is being sure that you have the you have the right to be in the country, and you apply for the appropriate status that you qualify for.
Thank you very much. Now there's maybe a more political question, more organizative, and it's more directed directly to the CPB, to the Communist Party. Is there a union that the CPB has a more favorable relationship with, that the Communist Party would, let's say, recommend to join to their throughout their social activity?
Well, I'll pick up on this because I did touch on this in my presentation about what is the most appropriate trade union to join. Now, there are certain trade unions which you would hope would organise in your workplace because they have, should I say, a better reputation in terms of their democratic accountability and their encouragement of a membership-led union and their particular approach to campaigning and their political education and all sorts of other things. But the most vital issue for when you join a trade union is what is its relevance to your workplace. And so there's no point just because the RMT, which is a transport union, is very industrially radical and it's got a good political campaigning and industrial ethos. There's no good you joining that if you're working in the health service, and unless your job in the health service is transport, which could be, I suppose. But so it's the key thing is really to join the union that organises in your workplace, because I think the onus on communists in particular, but I would say on all trade union members, is to make your union as good as it can be. Now, some of the structures of some of the unions are much more top down, and so that creates a much more of a challenging environment. But nonetheless, that is certainly my position, and I believe that's the CP's position in terms of you engage where the workers are, not where you would like them to be.
Yeah, I mean, if I could say, I think this is one of those areas where Spain is different from Britain, and we have historically, since 1868, one centre, and you don't chop between different centres according to their politics at the time. So I sit very easily with Dominic's description. I think one of the areas amongst young people where it is changing, though, is that there are sectors of the economy now where there is no trade union. You know, I'm thinking of things like Uber drivers, Deliveroo, etc. And some of the bigger unions have done really well in terms of reorientating the way they organise, say with Uber drivers in GMB, and have won some significant victories. But other unions have struggled, and so smaller unions have popped up. And I think that the trade unions as a whole need to look on those smaller trade unions, not as competitors, but as people to work with.
Thank you both. I will continue with the questions because we do have quite a few. So after this question, we have another maybe broad and also very political. What does it need to happen so that we can have, or that there should be a mass strike in the UK? Because as far as I know, there's been quite a bit of time between now and the last mass strike here in the UK. So what would it need to happen, and what maybe would be the role of the party in trying to organize or trying to push forward such an event if it were to happen?
I don't mind.
Shall I go first, and then there isn't a shortcut to this process, and as I described in my presentation, there is a very draconian rules around how to actually get to industrial action, and the larger the scale of the industrial action, the more challenging are the hurdles put in the way. And so the industrial actions which have been successful in recent years have been either conducted by the smaller trade unions dealing with a very distinct bargaining unit, where they've been able to focus a lot of campaigning, and they relate very closely with their members, and so they can overcome the bureaucratic hurdles which the state has put in the way of taking industrial action. But as I also referenced in my presentation, the Communication Workers Union did manage to get over those hurdles, those thresholds, for a very large group of workers, amounting to, I think, around 200,000 workers in the postal services, and that was through a real grassroots engagement and a real deployment of trade union resources around communication and organising of members. So it does require trade unions to probably rebalance their organisations away from, I suppose, bureaucracy and into organising at the workplace level. One thing that the Communist Party has argued long in our role within trade unions is the need for political, that's small p and large p, political education to ensure that the membership of trade unions are clearly understand their relationship in terms of not only the workplace, but in terms of society more generally, and the forces that are ranged against them, and the need to win victories and not just wait for them to be delivered to you, because that will never happen. So I think the lesson is that trade unions need to connect better with their membership. That means deploying more organising resources to ensure that they have got better structures at the workplace level, so that when they are trying to encourage members to engage in disputes, they're able to reach out and connect with them directly. And one of the benefits of this pandemic is that the trade union movement, as we are now having this virtual meeting, the trade union movement has probably advanced 10 years in the last year in terms of how it relates to its membership. And so we're using webinars, we're using social media, we're using direct text and emails more. So we're the connection between ordinary members and their trade union, and more clearly identifying with the work of the trade union, has improved, I believe, over this pandemic. So you're not waiting for a trade union organizer to visit your workplace and have a walk around your workplace. We are much more accessible through the adaptation of this remote connections. So I think there are opportunities, but it does require the political will within the trade union movement to take on these challenges. But there are lots of serious obstacles in the way of the types of large-scale national strikes that we have seen in the past.
Thank you, Dominic. I don't know if you want to add anything to this answer.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. Of course, it requires a high level of class consciousness. And this is a debate that goes back 100 years, because it's the debate that was held very powerfully within German workers' movement with Luxemburg and Kautsky and the mass strike. And I think from the British experience, we don't have any real tradition of propaganda strikes. Strikes are strikes, and they are about real things and changing the balance of power rather than to protest. And so they have to be real, and to be effective, even if the law said you only needed 10%, communists would still fight for the maximum possible turnout, because the action only carries weight when there is a significant majority within a workplace and people want action to take place. As Dominic said, I think that there's an extra ingredient now, which is that Thatcher was able to disassemble so much of the employment legislation to the point where most people wouldn't know, but it is in fact illegal in this country to take strike action in support of somebody abroad. Now, when I was younger and Franco was about to murder the young men in 1974, it would have been, the TUC in this country called a mass demonstration that had tens of thousands and threatened the British government with a general strike if they didn't intervene to try and save the young men's lives. And as it happens, they were all killed. That kind of action would be strictly illegal now. And so any strike of a political mass character would be challenging the law as well as the employers, which brings you up against the state, which has much greater power and resources to defeat strikes. This isn't to say it doesn't happen. This is to say these are the things, the factors that we have to consider. And I think that one of the things that came out of the Kautsky-Luxemburg debate was that you would only launch a mass strike if you already had the capacity to take it another step further. Because if you launch a mass strike, like the miners did in 1926 or in 1984, you have to define what it is you're striking for. So you have to go back to work one day, unless you're challenging the power of government, which has also happened in this country in the early 1970s. A conservative government was effectively broken by a strike. So I just think that for us as communists, we look for self-reliance in the first instance. We look to organisation, but we're also not frightened of looking to the law. And I started my days as an organiser amongst what was then called MIRUG, which is Migrant, Immigrant and Refugee Unionisation Communities. And in particular, the Colombians that were working in Oxford Street, the Portuguese that were working in West London, they had very different traditions and struggled to understand why the British weren't constantly launching propaganda strikes. And we always said to them, rely on yourselves, organise, but use the law where you can.
Thank you very much for this very complete answer from both of you. We keep on with the questions. This one is maybe a bit more specific. Now, as Dominic has introduced, there's many kinds of contracts that that a worker can have here in the UK. And one of the ones that offers one of the highest degrees of precariousness in terms of working rights is the 0-hour contract. Javier asks if there's any chance to fight against and forbid these kind of contracts, these 0-hour contracts, in the near future, if there's any actual movement already happening or organizing against these contracts.
Yeah, I can give you some examples of what we've done in Wales, and through the Workforce Partnership Council, which I referenced in my presentation. One of the key one of the areas which we did discuss was 0-hour contracts, and one of the things that we got an agreement, a tripartite agreement, and this is for the devolved public sector, but also for contracts which provide services in those devolved areas, is that where people have been working on 0-hour contracts for a period of time, and I think off the top of my head, I think it was a 12-week period, then they could seek a review of their contractual position with the obligation on the employer to offer them a contract with a guarantee of the hours which they have worked over that average. So what that means is that it's only the genuinely casual workers that would remain on the 0-hour contracts, and those where the 0-hour contracts have been abused to avoid people in effect acquiring their legitimate rights, that is picked up under this this agreement, this tripartite agreement. On top of that, we're looking at the social partnership and public procurement bill, which is currently going through the Senate, and will hopefully get a Welsh government in place after the 6th of May, which will turn that into an act of the part of the Welsh Parliament. Then we're looking at that this being linked to the procurement process as well, in terms of in effect abolishing 0-hour contracts totally. Now, having said that, there are some 0-hour contracts do cover some areas where people don't want to commit to set amount of hours. So you can have genuine casual contracts, and this may appeal to people who just want to work literally casually and don't want the commitment of a 12, 15, 30-hour contract. So where there are legitimate reasons for that, and that there are legitimate benefits to the workers to have them, then that seems fine. But the misuse and abuse of 0-hour contract is certainly being challenged by trade unions in Wales.
Can I just say, Mark, that on the can I put do you mind if I put a link into the discussion?
No, of course.
Comment? And if I put it into the private chat, maybe you can lob it over. So just very quickly, on the 29th of May, and again on the 5th of June, the Communist Party is organising 2 major events for trade union activists. The first is concerned with how different people are reacting to fighting unemployment and job restructuring. But the second one is about how we organise in order to oppose that. And in the first meeting, there's a speaker from PCE on the bill to outlaw gig employees contracts. So I think that if people may be interested in coming along to those events, and they'd certainly be very welcome.
Of course, thank you, Phil. I've copied the link that you were referencing, so you will all find it in your in the YouTube chat. So you can copy and paste it in your navigator and find out about these talks that Phil is talking about. Following with our questions, and in a very similar fashion, let me find it. Yes, employers' references might might cause an employee to feel, let's say, more dependent to their employer if there's a reference needed for him to find work in his next job, which will establish a relation of power and will facilitate a greater degree of exploitation if the worker feels that he needs to, let's say, make happy as much as possible his employer, and therefore in order to ask for a proper reference. So Javier asks, what do the unions think about using previous employers' references in professional recruitment? And is there any campaign against it?
Okay, well, there is a requirement to provide references, and that is the current situation. But interestingly enough, employers are moving away from actually saying too much in a reference, and so we're getting much more of a trend of just basic factual references. So this person was employed on date X and left on date Y, and in between time they had X no disciplinary issues, and they had a X number of sick days during that period. So all very much data which is can be checked and corroborated. And the reason for that is twofold. One is if an employer actually does too glowing a reference, which actually disguises the inabilities of a worker because they just want to get rid of them, so they give them a nice, good reference to encourage them to go. Employers who receive that person and find that reference is actually completely subjective and not factual have a potential claim against the previous employer. And likewise, if you if you find that there's something in your reference which is again subjectively detrimental and which has prevented you from taking up a post, then you also have a potential claim against the employer for presenting a non-factual reference. So so although it is a real concern, and to ensure that you I suppose you don't spoil your copybook in your workplace in order to ensure that you can get over that next employment hurdle. It is not as big a factor as most people suspect it is, and probably for that reason, I'm not aware of any particular trade union campaign to do away with it. What we do is make sure that it's not abused, and we hold employers to account if we feel that the employment reference has been abused.
Thank you very much, Dominic. Now there's 3 questions left. There's 2 of them that I see that they might require a bit of a broader answer. So I will first go for the one that is maybe more specific. Yolanda asks, is it true that some workplaces do not recognize trade unions? And if that's the case, what can the workers do?
Okay, well, I think I did touch on this in my presentation, is that there is no automatic right to a trade union recognition, unless you're actually already part of a collective bargaining arrangement. And there unfortunately, the norm is more towards not being covered by a collective bargaining arrangement and a recognition arrangement than being covered. So you have got a right to be in a trade union, even if the employer doesn't recognize that trade unions, and they can't discriminate against you for being in a trade union. But in terms of how that's going to benefit you in your workplace, that's not going to be much of assistance. It may be assistance in terms of protecting you from abuse by your employer. It doesn't actually help you in terms of improving your situation in your workplace. So if you find yourself with an employer that doesn't recognise a trade union and for collective bargaining purposes, there is a mechanism to get trade union recognition, which is through the I'm sort of trying to remember. It's the CAC, and which I did refer to in my presentation, but without referring to my notes, I can't remember exactly what it is. It's an arbitration service, but you apply to that. Yeah, you apply to the CAC. But you need to get the trade union that you're a member of to take organising in that workplace seriously, because you need to get over a threshold of 10% membership within that what described as a bargaining unit, and you have to get into some discussion with the CAC over what constitutes a bargaining unit. So you may have a multinational employer, which employs 100,000 workers, but you don't have to have 10% of that 100,000 workers in that multinational employer. You just need to be able to have 10% of the staff within that bargaining unit. So they may be providing a particular service, and as long as you get 10% of the membership, you can then apply for a ballot of all the staff, irrespective of their trade union membership. And if that ballot gets over the threshold of 50%, then you will win trade union recognition. The employer will be compelled to recognise the trade union for collective bargaining purposes. A less likely scenario is that you have you get over 50% of that bargaining unit staff, and that becomes and if you can evidence that, that becomes an automatic granting of recognition, and again the employer will be directed to recognise the trade union. So yeah, it's not a given, and it's if the other thing is if you trigger a ballot and you're unsuccessful in getting over that 50%, you're not allowed to ballot again for another three years. So it's a big move for a trade union to initiate that ballot, because you've got to be really confident that you can win it, because you'll be barred from balloting again for another 3 years.
Thank you, Dominic.
Can I
just, Mark, of course, just send you another link. During the 2017 general election, Labour worked with an organisation called the Institute for Employment Rights to develop an alternative framework of workers' rights, and this proved to be a very, very popular vote winner. And it was used again in 2019, and I've got I think the main parts of it are online and they're free for anybody to look at. So if I give you that reference, maybe you could pass that on.
Yes, I found it now. Okay. As before, I will leave the
thank you
link that Phil is referencing to in the Facebook chat, so you can all have it there. Okay, thank you both for these for your answers. Now, moving to the next question. Again, this is a relatively broad question. So Gordon asks, could you explain further the relationship between trade unions and the Labour Party? I have understood that the trade union movement created the Labour Party, but what is it? What is the current relationship, and how much strength does they have? I assume how much strength does the trade union movement has inside the Labour Party?
Well, Dom, you went first last time. Shall I go first? Yeah, I mean,
if you want, yes.
This is one of the things that is unique about the situation in Britain. There is an echo of it in countries like Germany, where in Britain, the trade unions came first, followed by the political organisation. And the Labour Party is largely based for the first half of its history on the trade unions. So to be a member of the Labour Party up until the middle 1920s, you had to be a trade unionist. And thereafter, a political struggle within the Labour Party developed, sometimes to the left, sometimes to the right, around two things. One was the Statement of Aims, which was called Clause 4, which was developed in 1918, which said that the aims of the Labour Party were to transform the ownership of the means of distribution, production and exchange. It was something like that. So that's been a centre of struggle. And the other was over the relative voting strength of the trade unions within Labour as against the individual members of Labour, as against the MPs. And for example, when Blair came in, the first thing he did was to get rid of the Statement of Aims and tried to change the name of the organisation. And that was resisted relatively successfully in some ways in the long run by the trade unions. So the trade unions still have a big say, but there's the leadership is divided, how do you say, determined by votes in different electoral colleges. And some of these are in the trade unions, some are individual members who no longer have to be trade union members, and some are amongst the MPs. And it's a relative battle of ideas within Labour, depending on what's going on outside as well. When the Communist Party is strong, the left in Labour is strong. When it's weak, the right wing tend to dominate. And this is the historical move. That some people think that a revolution in Britain means that you have to get rid of the Labour Party. It's a very mechanical way of looking at things. The Labour Party's changed a lot over the last 100+ years, and it will change again. And there are many good elements in the Labour Party that work effortlessly with the communists, but there are others who would do everything they could to exclude us. And so it's that relationship that really is going to determine the future political direction of the workers' movement. That's just some thoughts.
Yeah, and I'm grateful for Phil for the historical context to it. And the only thing I'd like to add is that the trade union movement is the potential mass base which extends what Corbyn turned the Labour Party into a very large political party, but it's still dwarfed by the membership of the trade union movement, which amounts to in excess of 8 million. So in terms of the strength of the trade union influence in the Labour Party, really is determined by, I suppose, the effectiveness of those trade unions and the political awareness of the membership within those trade unions. And so, as communists, I think we always, where we're involved in the trade unions, we're always looking to extend the education of trade unionists beyond the just dealing with how you run grievances and disciplinaries and how you defend workers in their workplace, but also to extend to social policy and extend to political campaigning and the need for having political funds. And this is another area where the Tory governments have tried to neuter the trade union movement by, in effect, trying to persuade our own members, to vote against having political funds. And so it actually became, when that was attempted to be used against us, we actually effectively mobilised our respective membership in defence of political funds. And in fact, the number of political funds extended during that period, because a number of trade unions that didn't have a political fund actually decided that they'd actually ballot their members for a political fund. So I think it's all mixed in. That there isn't a straight linear answer to the question, but it's certainly a challenge for trade unionists and in particular communists within trade unions to ensure that we keep our membership engaged in the political as well as the industrial.
Yes, thank you very much, Dominic and Phil. We get now to the final question, which is actually a bit of a question also to ourselves, to the Spanish Communist Party. Yolanda asks, how could we get our message to the Spanish community, in particular, the Spanish community in Great Britain?
Can I answer that?
Mm-hmm.
I think probably my knowledge is out of date, because I was organising in communities in London in the 80s and 90s. But it was always interesting that probably the then biggest community weren't organised as trade unionists, and that was the Spanish community, which historically had deep roots in London. There was no comisiones, no UGT, and yet the Italians had an office with full-time organisers for Chile. The Portuguese had organisers, the Colombians had organisers, and some of the unions, like the Transport and General Workers Union, had international branches, which were mainly made up of migrant and immigrant workers, particularly working in things like textiles, food, retailing, hospitality. And I don't know whether that exists amongst Spanish people now, but I do know that the numbers in London are way bigger than when I was an organizer. Somebody said to me recently that the 6th biggest city in France is now London and the Southeast. That's how many people are working here. So I think that there's real capacity for somebody like Comisiones to be working alongside the British trade unions. And there are parts of the country, for example, where I'm speaking to you from, where the communists are campaigning in the east of England, and we have to have our material translated into Spanish and Portuguese, because so many of the workers in food processing come maybe for 3 months, then they go back to Madeira or to Mallorca, then they come back for another 3 months. And there's a lot of scope for organising and for common demands to emerge, I think. And I think also I don't know if Dominic would agree with me, but I believe the mindset of the British unions is much more open than when I was a young man. If, for example, I was involved in a recent campaign to organise minicab drivers at one of the big train stations in Cambridge. And the union said, well, what's the communities that the drivers are from? They were overwhelmingly Turkish or Bangladeshi. So the union was, through its offices open, and provided free English language courses, but based around union issues. So I think that there's capacity there to do that organising. And I think you'd find that the unions would be very strongly for it as well.
Yeah, and just I think I agree with Phil that the trade union movement generally it would be receptive to reaching out, but I think we don't do it very effectively unless it's put on. The issue is right in front of us, such as a particular bargaining or dispute with an employer where we need to focus our organising in that with that workforce, and if that workforce is based on a migrant population, then we would put our energies to it. But I think that the work that I spoke about previously with unison with the Settle campaign did certainly put us in touch with more EU, directly with more EU workers than we'd been in touch with before, and certainly I'm aware of some of those who have turned into trade union activists as a result, and we also have we have a I think we have a good track record of assisting migrant workers in our contemporary and historical background. So if a community was reaching out to us, I think they'd get a very receptive response. And just taking, for example, and Phil mentioned about free classes, we have the Wales Union Learning Fund, and there is I think the Union Learning Fund in the rest of the UK, I think, has been pulled by the UK government, but we still retain it in Wales. And what that focuses is on is upskilling the workforce, whether it's in basic communication, basic literacy, whether it's in technological literacy, or whether it's around a particular professional skill, and those are all free courses which are accessed through the trade union movement. So I think there is certainly lots to be gained from migrant communities reaching out to the trade unions, and obviously vice versa in terms of building our reach with the wider communities.
Thank you very much, both. If I may partially also contribute something to this question, because it does ask, I mean, this question is very powerful also to us. Obviously, our section that we have, our little nucleo that we have here in the UK is quite recent. We are only 2 years old. And one of the problems that we've come across is that, yes, trying to reaching out to Spanish people in particular has at least two big problems. One is the language barrier that a worker might find in trying to organize himself or herself with the local trade unions, or having any sort of even access to counseling in terms of their labor rights. And the other one is that many of the workers that are here, especially if they are in conditions of relatively unstable, if they don't have really long plans to stay, which is the vast majority of the cases, there's a very big deal of the people that it is known that live here, but they're not even registered, for instance, in the embassies. And that creates a problem in terms of, for instance, communicating and reaching these people. So obviously the task is ours to try to reach to our fellow, in that case, Spaniards and our comrades, if they are politically organized. There are many organizations that we know that are not directly related to the trade union movement, but that offer counsel in these sort of affairs in terms of labor rights. I can mention now Oficina Precaria, we're talking of Marea Granate, we're talking of citizens' rights projects. This is some of the few little agrupations of people that try to, yes, offer this kind of contact to the people that live here, but it's definitely not enough. So the task is ours to try to reach out to the Spanish community in our workplaces, to reach out to the Spanish community in the trade unions, as we would with our fellow working class here in Britain, but obviously being as Spaniards and having this facility to try to help our own and facilitating their installment here in these countries, maybe one of the responsibilities that we have, particularly as a Communist Party. Thank you very much to both of you. This round of questions has gone beyond the 20-30 minutes that we had as an objective. So thank you very much for your questions. They have been incredibly complete and they're definitely very valuable. I will have quite a bit of work trying to translate all these in Spanish so that we can all have the subtitles, but it will be done. With this, we start moving forward to the, well, this is the first big event, let's say, that we have online as the Communist Party here in UK in terms of trying to reaching out to local people here, in that case with comrades from the CPB and you, Dominic, as a member of a trade union here in the UK. We are inviting now to speak Africa, our comrade that is responsible for the external affairs in the global international section of the CPB, of the PCE, sorry. So, and I will introduce her in Spanish as well. África, gracias por estar aquí. Eres, para quien no te conozca, eres la responsable del área externa de la sección, bueno, del PCE en el exterior. Y nada, vienes aquí un poco a explicarnos qué es lo que hacemos, ¿no? Como PCE Exterior, cómo nos organizamos y cuál es un poco nuestro objetivo en esta organización de los diferentes núcleos que existen no solo en Gran Bretaña, que es nuestro caso, sino también, por ejemplo, en Francia, Bélgica, etc. Así que muchas gracias y cuando quieras.
Camaradas y compañeras. Bueno, en primer lugar, no soy Rosa Luque. Os vais a tener que conformar conmigo hoy. Rosa me pide que la disculpe, pero bueno, por causa mayor no puede estar aquí hoy con nosotras. Así que nada, para quien no me conozca, pues eso, África Moreno, soy responsable del área externa en el PCE Exterior. Y en primer lugar, bueno, quería agradecer al núcleo de Gran Bretaña por haber organizado este acto que me parece tan interesante como necesario. Y bueno, voy a cambiar al inglés. I would love to extend our gratitude to Phil, Dominic and Judith for their time and for sharing their knowledge and their expertise with us here today. So thank you. Bueno, pues como bien decía Marc, yo vengo un poco a hablar, hemos estado hablando de organizarnos, así que yo vengo a hablar un poco de cuál es el papel del Partido Comunista en el exterior con este escenario, ¿no? Bueno, en una primera etapa, desde nuestra formación, refundación en 2018, porque, bueno, no somos la primera ola migratoria y de esto daría para otro acto entero. Nuestro objetivo en un primer momento fue el de poner en marcha un mecanismo de partido para que toda la militancia desde los diferentes países de acogida trabajara de forma coordinada, más allá de nuestras fronteras territoriales, ¿no? Entonces, en esta segunda etapa en la que nos encontramos ahora, nuestro objetivo principal sería convertirnos en una herramienta para la clase trabajadora española emigrante, una herramienta para luchar y para defender sus intereses en los países de acogida, tanto los países de acogida como en España, con el objetivo y con la finalidad de revertir esa situación que les hizo emigrar en un primer momento y les permita regresar si así lo desean. Bueno, ¿y cómo hacemos esto? Pues entre otras muchas, nuestras líneas de trabajo pues se centran en la formación que llevamos a cabo tanto a nivel interno como externo, como estamos haciendo hoy aquí, ¿no? En este acto tan interesante. Luego, bueno, pues como partido marxista-leninista, pues analizamos nuestra realidad material y intentamos detectar los problemas que nos afectan, ¿no? y que son inherentes y derivados de nuestra condición tanto de clase trabajadora como emigrantes. Luego también intentamos estar presentes en todos los movimientos sociales, en todos los espacios en los que haya clase trabajadora y trabajamos, como estamos viendo hoy también, codo con otras asociaciones y organizaciones hermanas, como el CPB y, por supuesto, con los sindicatos. Entonces, bueno, pues un poco con el motivo del 1 de mayo y desde la Secretaría de Movimiento Obrero consideramos indispensable reivindicar la necesidad de organizarse de la clase trabajadora para luchar por sus derechos y para mirar por sus intereses. En el contexto en el que nos encontramos, siendo la clase trabajadora y en especial la emigrante por su vulnerabilidad, la que está sufriendo con mayor crueldad las consecuencias de la pandemia. Por ejemplo, en marzo y abril de 2020, cuando la mayor parte de la población europea estábamos confinadas en casa, excepto las trabajadoras esenciales, muchas de ellas emigrantes también, bueno, pues pudimos ver que el Producto Interior Bruto cayó a unos niveles nunca vistos desde la Segunda Guerra Mundial. Bueno, ¿esto qué es lo que nos muestra? Nos demuestra una vez más que el motor de la economía y quien genera la riqueza es la clase trabajadora, no el capital. Aún así, se ha legislado continuamente para salvar la economía por encima de la salud de las personas. Entonces, ahora más que nunca debemos estar unidas y luchar por construir un modelo social y político basado en la solidaridad entre los pueblos y el internacionalismo que defiendan nuestros intereses de clase. Así que, en nombre del Partido Comunista de España en el exterior, queremos transmitirnos, bueno, que estamos a vuestra entera disposición. Sabemos muy bien que ser inmigrante es sinónimo de precariedad, es sinónimo de vulnerabilidad, de incertidumbre, es sinónimo de falta de redes de apoyo y entonces, bueno, pues un compromiso militante es difícil, pero también nos animamos a trabajar con nosotras a modo de simpatizantes. Estáis invitadas a nuestras formaciones, a los eventos que podamos organizar en un futuro y sobre todo abiertas a contestar cualquier pregunta que os pueda surgir. Así que nada, bueno, desde aquí el mensaje que quiero lanzar es que viva la lucha de la clase obrera y que viva el 1 de mayo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, comrade. Gracias, Africa. With this, I want, Africa, to personally thank you all again and thank also Judith to her contribution that now is not here. But again, it's been fantastic. All your talks has been wonderful. The session of questions that we had, the questions and answers we had afterwards, it will definitely be helpful for anyone that watches this event. And with this, I finally introduce our secretary of the branch that we have here in the UK. And with this, we close finally this event. So again, thank you much everyone for their contributions. And Alejandro, cuando quieras, pues cierras el acto. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Marc. First of all, many thanks today to our panel for their speeches and, of course, their answers to all the questions. They've been so interesting and so important, and I think they are going to be super useful in the future for the migrant community, not just the Spanish community, because the event is in English. So hopefully they will be useful for other migrants as well. Today has been a great opportunity to learn a little bit more about the country where we are living in. And it's been so important as well to learn a little bit more about our rights, future challenges in the workers' struggle. I hope that we can hold more events like today's event, because it's important to carry on joining forces with not just migrant workers, workers of all United Kingdom. Before swapping to Spanish, I'd like to give a massive thank you as well to Marc for being our host today, and as well to the people that are behind the scenes doing all the arrangements to make this possible. So a massive thank you to you guys as well. Now I'm going to swap into Spanish. Hago the notes here. Y me gustaría mucho agradecer de nuevo a los ponentes y a toda la gente que ha hecho posible este evento. Creo que ha sido una gran primera piedra de toque de nuestro núcleo aquí en Gran Bretaña y espero que esto se vuelva a producir en un futuro, lo más próximo posible o cercano, porque son jornadas muy interesantes para todos los y las trabajadoras migradas desde el Estado español aquí a Reino Unido y como he dicho también creo que es extensible a otros compañeros y compañeras de otras latitudes, incluso también diría para los propios compañeros y compañeras nativos de este país. Me gustaría también animar desde aquí a toda la inmigración procedente de España a que se organicen activamente en las organizaciones de clase o las organizaciones de migrantes que existan en su localidad o cerca de ella, porque son una buena oportunidad no solo para crear esos lazos que puedes echar en falta cuando vives en un país extranjero, sino también es una buena oportunidad para seguir creciendo y para seguir intentando mejorar un poco las condiciones de vida a las que nos enfrentamos cuando emigramos a otro país. Como ha dicho mi camarada África, me gustaría también ofrecer este espacio de lucha que es el Partido Comunista a todos y todas las emigrantes españolas y españoles y deciros que las puertas están abiertas para toda la clase trabajadora y que no dudéis en visitar nuestras redes sociales y no dudéis en también poneros en contacto con nosotros si así lo deseáis para seguir nuestra actividad, para conocer un poco más a fondo nuestra organización o para uniros si así lo consideráis porque pensáis que este es el lugar de lucha, lo cual se os recibirá con los brazos abiertos y evidentemente se os proporcionará con toda la formación y todo lo que necesitéis para poder desarrollar vuestro trabajo militante. Por aquí nada más, simplemente dar de nuevo las gracias a toda la gente que ha hecho posible esto y a nuestros ponentes y tanto a Judith como a Phil y como a Dominic. Thank you very much to all of you guys and I hope see you soon and
good luck.
Keep fighting, keep fighting.
Yes, thank you for the invite. It's excellent.
Viva el 1 de mayo.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dominic.
And vote communist on the 6th.
Exactly, yes.
See you soon.
Okay.
Cheers.
See you.